So today I'm going to be talking about banks, banks as credit intermediaries. So talking about banks is important for a number of reasons. Number one is that we have talked last time mostly about the informal market, maybe an informal provider of credit either in a rural environment or urban environment. And one of the things that comes out of the model is that the cost of fund is there's going to be a multiplier on the cost of fund for the interest rate. So the fact that these people may not have access to cheap capital will actually have an outsized effect potentially on the interest rate. And so one can imagine that the banks would be, just because they have access to a cheap source of capital, that in and of itself will reduce the interest rate. Plus the type of argument that one of you pointed out before, I think it was you, that they might have the ability to have some economies of scales in setting up accounts and things like that, monitoring and such, which would again reduce the fixed cost of monitoring and therefore have an outside effect on the interest rate. So one should be looking at that. The other reason why it's important to, another reason why it's important to look at banks is because in many developing countries, starting in the 1960s and really up to today to some extent with waves and ebb and flows a little bit, have really counted on the banking sector as an alternative to the informal credit sector, often pictured as kind of evil and not just limited. On Monday we talked about informal sector that was generally benign. It was even competitive in our model. It was just limited by the fact that it had all this large fixed cost of monitoring. But the representation of the credit market, certainly in the 60s to some extent today as well, is that these people are just, also horrible and taking advantage of villagers, etc. So governments have stepped in and either directly nationalized the banks or leaned on the existing banking sector to try and go in a little bit beyond the comfort zone of the banks, which would have been to lend maybe to only the largest firm and lead them to lend to smaller firms or rural areas or things like that. So one example, but it's really just one of many, is that in India, banks were nationalized in the 1960s. Not all of them, but a large fraction of banks were nationalized in the 1960s. And then banks were given the responsibility to go in the rural areas. So in particular, they had a rule that if you wanted to open one bank in one branch in a bank to location like a city, you had to go and open at least 4 branches in unbanked areas. So this was the area known as social banking, with that 1:4 rule, which continued until the 1990s, where they kind of got rid of that. And then the second thing that still exists today in India, and in fact we're going to spend a lot of time talking about it today, is priority sector lending, which forces banks to lend a certain fraction of their portfolio to what they call the priority sector, which is made of small enterprises, SMEs, in fact small and medium enterprises. The medium could even be large by the standard of the vast multitude of small firms in India, but small and medium sector, the rural sector, and microcredit, which actually has sneaked into as a priority sector, which has been very important for the fast development of microcredit in India in the 2000s. So the banks have been sort of a tool, nationalization of the banks have been a tool. So looking at banks as intermediary is pretty important. A third reason, of course, is that bank are the only a bank, and then the financial markets, maybe bond market, stock market, etc., are the only institutions that the ability to lend to larger firms and therefore to how well they function is going to be important for determining the allocation among large firms, which is where a lot of the output is produced. So thinking of banks is needed. And then again, if we're thinking about the importance of the cost of monitoring as an activity, then thinking about the bank as an organization, what are the pluses and minuses of the bank as an organization in its ability to monitor clients is pretty essential. So that's what I'm going to spend time on bank today, and in particular on how bank function internally, both a little bit of a theory model and then a lot of empirical work. So banks take money from depositors and lend them to firms. Many people have no idea, the only place where they can really put their money is in the banks, and therefore banks have very, very low cost to capital. They can offer pretty much zero interest rate to their depositor. But then so that's a very good thing from the point of view of the model we were discussing before. But the problem is that banks tend to be very conservative lenders for various reasons. There is regulation reasons, which is banks need to have enough liquidity all the time. They cannot, they have to keep reserve. They have to have enough liquidity all the time, so they can't make, they are heavily regulated. Even bank in the US, in France, in Europe, etc., heavily regulated, even more so in developing countries. The priority sector regulation is an example of that. To some extent, they are under political control. We'll discuss that in detail earlier. They have bad information. So you were talking about, maybe banks have economies of scale in undertaking some monitoring activities. But the key problem of banks is that they are not local and they have no connection to the local economy. So first order, they are going to be at a disadvantage, in fact, in terms of monitoring, because they have very bad information. And finally, banks are large, therefore they have to use agents to do the lending. And these agents are receive much less in salary than the amount of money that they handle, and therefore they have to be given incentives to lend, of course, but also not to default, and that's a little bit difficult to achieve these two things at the same time. So what I want to do now is to focus on that, is to focus on this problem of the agent of a bank. And in particular to explain or to think about an issue that you may or may not have heard, but is really very prevalent in many developing country problem, which is the problem of evergreening. So evergreening is the bank officer version of the rolling over the loans that we were discussing earlier, which is you have a client that is doing poorly, and instead of cutting them off now, you give them another loan so that they can reimburse your first loan in the hope that some miracle is going to happen later. And of course, evergreening eventually, occasionally it might end up well. Most of the time, you're going to have just a larger default in the past. So evergreening is a big problem in the Indian financial sector. Sometimes it is just plain malevolent. You have, and we were talking last time about some clients of banks might have just political power on the banks and just able to force their hands and making that happen. And I'll talk about that a little bit later today, about the politics of banking. But sometimes it could just be a result of the incentives that are faced by the loan officers. So what I want to spend the next few minutes on that, which is a model of evergreening and the type of consequences that it's going to have on the allocation of credit. So it's a model that, if you want to see the actual model in all its beauty, it's in the paper with Abhijit on which is called Do Firms Want to Borrow More? That's the theoretical model that's at the back of it. So you have two categories of firms. You have good firms and bad firms. And the bad firms are not horrible, but sometimes they fail, where their project fail. Whereas the good firms, the firm of type H, they always succeed. So they have an investment, ignore moral hazard, ignore adverse selection, because at the beginning, the firms don't even know their type. There are good firms, bad firms, and then they try to do a project. If they succeed, they get an output. If they fail, they get 0, and assume that the output is increasing in capital and it's concave, like a nicely behaved production function. So each firm lives for 2 periods. At the end of the second period, they shut down. There's no discounting. The gross interest rate is 1. It's all very simple. And assume that for a high firm, they'll succeed. For bad firms, every time they get to draw with the probability of success or failure. There is no deliberate default, no choice of projects, basically no action by the firm. We are really focusing here on the loan officer. So if they get 0, of course they can't pay. They start with 0, they don't have savings. The firms, again, succeed, the good firms succeed all the time, the low firm with this probability PL. And then the lending on behalf of the bank is decided on by loan officers. Loan officers get incentive to borrow, they have to lend, they have to dispose of their portfolio. So they have a portfolio to lend, they have to lend all of it. And they also have an incentive to avoid default. So if there is a default, they get punished, some fine. So they also live for 2 periods. There is no discounting. They need to lend their portfolio. They need to avoid default. And so specifically, the loan officer starts with a population of firms. Let's say it's a continuous of firm of size 1. And then in the second period, they get promoted a little bit. They get somewhat more money to lend. And they are free to allocate it. At the beginning, there is no information in the system. They have no information, the bank has no information, the firm has no information, so they just draw a random pool and they lend the money. But after the first period, some information is revealed that becomes common knowledge between the firm and the agent, but that the bank doesn't have. I mean, the bank has no independent information from what the loan officer has. And then if there is a default, they get punished per unit of default. So you get a fine of F per unit defaulted. So a larger default is more costly than a smaller default, but even you want to avoid default if you can. So in the first period, there is not too much of a choice. They get a random draw. They're lending their money. So there is nothing they have to do there. But at the end of the first period, if the borrower has failed, then it has to be that they are bad. Because if they were good, they would succeed with probability 1. So you have some information from everybody who has failed. If they are successful, then they could be either good or bad. And assume that in some cases, you actually know that they are good. You get a signal, independent signal, that they have succeeded because they are good. And you get that signal with probability pi. So some people, you know they are bad because they are failed. Some people, you know they're good because they've succeeded and you get that signal. And some people you don't know. Because they've succeeded, they could be either good or bad, but lucky. Now, you still learn something because the probability that they are good is informed by the fact that they have not failed yet. So the probability that they are good is P1, which is P0 over P0 plus 1 minus P0 times PL. So that's greater than P0. Intuition of that is that if you have not failed yet, even if I don't have a signal on you, at least I know that you haven't failed yet. So you have a slightly higher probability to be a good guy. So we have now 3 types of firms. The firms that are known to be bad, the firms that are known to be good, and the firms on which there is some uncertainty, which we are going to call U. And the question we are asking now is, what is the loan officer going to do? From a social welfare point of view, what should the loan officer do? They should lend to the, first they should give all of the money the good firms, the known good firms need, they should give them. And then they should give the rest to the U firm because there is a larger probability that there is some probability that they are good, and they shouldn't lend to the bad one, at least under some assumption that I'm going to put now. We should go in this direction. but what are they actually going to do? So the first decision you have to take is what to do about the firms that have failed. You can, and here's a choice between report a default and get punished F for what has been lent to them, or bail out the firm in the hope that they will succeed again the next time. You know they are bad, but even bad firms succeed sometimes, so you might just get away with it. And that's the idea of evergreening. So you will, of course, only bail out if, when, in case of success, they will reimburse. If the bailout loan is L, the firms get to invest L minus 1 because you first have to repay 1 and you don't have anything to repay. So when I give you a loan of L, you need to immediately give me back 1 to reimburse your previous loan so that there is no default. So what's left for the firm to invest is L minus 1. And it has to be that the F of L minus 1 is greater than L, so that in case of success, they'll be able to reimburse. So that's the minimum size that you need to give is L star, such that F of L star minus 1 is equal to L star. Now, there is no reason to give more than the minimum because you know these guys are bad and you want to lend them as little as possible. So that's what you're going to lend to. That's what you're going to lend to them. Obviously, it's L star is greater than 1, but you're lending them the minimum you can, such that should they succeed, they can reimburse you in the next period. You know that's not going to happen all the time, but at least when it happens, you're going to get reimbursed. So if you're going to bail out, you're going to bail out at this L star for the bad firms. So the choice now, so you understand why there is absolutely no reason to give them more than L star. Like you don't want to put more at risk because from the point of view of the loan officer, all you want is a non-default. And anything more is put at risk, you would rather give it to the good firms or even to the unknown firms. So if you're going to bail out, you're going to bail out at L star. Therefore, now the question we need to answer is, should I want to bail out the firms that have failed? As a loan officer, what's best? Should I bail out the firms that have failed, or should I let them go and take the hit now? So the choice there is that from the point of view of the loan officer, bailout is better if the punishment today is greater than the punishment on the larger amount if I pay it. So this is the punishment, this is the expected punishment at the end of period 2. It's 1 minus PL that happens because that punishment will happen if the project fails, which is 1 minus PL, times what has been lent, which is L star times F. So let's assume that this holds. So this is beneficial for these guys to. So if that's not true, then there is no bailout and life is good. You're going to get evergreening when that is true, which is then when 1 is greater than 1 minus PL times L. So if that holds, then you're going to lend exactly L star to all the firms that have failed. So what you're left to lend now is this, which is 1 plus G, what you start from, minus what you've lent to these guys. All of the rest you're going to allocate between the other firms. So you might, you're going to, so the way they are going to do it is that all the money that of the money that is left, all of this, they are going to give that money to the firms that are known to be good first. That might finish all the money. If there are anything left, they're going to give it to the U firm in proportion of what's left. If that's not enough, then they might not even finish to pay, to give everything to the H firm. So what you're going to have is that in this equilibrium, all the second period firms go to first the type L, then the type H, and it might be that you get no loans at all. You have no reason to give, you're going to try and give all of the money to those firms that are good to be known. They can use the money. So in this equilibrium, there is going to be no money left for the unknown firms, because you're going to give everything to the good firms. They're going to be happy to take it. So you have a non-monotonous relation, which is if I'm looking at an econometrician of what the bank officer is doing, this is going to make no sense, because they are going to be giving money to good firms and to bad firms and not in between. So it's going to look like, what are they doing? And in addition, if I'm able to look at the marginal product of this money, if I were able to use the marginal product of this money, it's going to again look strange. So if I run something like an OLS regression of profit on how much is lent, I might get no relationship or a very funky relationship, because there is a combination of maybe the causal effect of using the money and the selection effect, which is part of the people who are getting money are pretty bad. So when I run an OLS regression, contrary to our intuition, which is the OLS regression between money given and profit would be upward biased because people who have better projects get more money. In this world, it might not be true, because in this world, the money is misallocated. Okay, so I might find that. On the other hand, if there is an exogenous shock, suddenly the guy has more to lend, then he's going to give this extra. So suppose that the amount to lend goes from 1 plus G to 1 plus G prime. You compare two people, two loan officers, one who has 1 plus G and one plus G prime. All of the extra money is going to go to the good people. So if I had an instrument, something that randomly some people were given G and 1 plus G, and some people were giving 1 plus G prime, by comparing these two types of officers, I would now get by comparing the clients of these two types of officers, I would now get the marginal effect, which would all be driven by the good guys. So you could get a situation where which is going to come soon, I have some exogenous increase currently in how much this money is to be lent out. That exogenous increase will go to the good funds. So as an econometrician, if I use that exogenous increase, I'm getting the marginal product of capital for good funds. And that might be very different from what I see in the cross-sectional relationship, where I observe first the marginal product of capital for good and bad firms mixed, and second, this selection, which is non-monotonous, a mix of good and bad firms. Yeah.
Is the incentive structure optimized in this model? Because if the loan officer didn't have punishment in case of default, they would loan to good firms, right?
Well, the problem is that there is something else. Like if they had no punishment in case of default, then they have no they don't care. So any small incentive will sway them. There is a reason why there is a reason in the background of this model for why you need to give people incentive to avoid default. Otherwise, they are going to lend to their friends or to their.
But maybe another incentive, such as if their probability of default on their clients is higher than some threshold.
Yes. So the answer to your first question, is the contract structure optimal in this model? Is no. Clearly, it's very crude, and we can see that it's not working. So there is surely. I imagine there is a better. There would be a better structure to structure the incentive. Interestingly, it is really the incentive that are given to loan officers typically. And even in newer organizations like microfinance organizations, that's also the type of incentive they have, a combination of incentives based on how much is being lent and default, simply because the bank, as the principal, has very little information that they can use to otherwise monitor the lend. But you're right that a non-linear incentive structure, if you allow that, might help. Yeah.
that...
I want to speak up.
Sorry, actually there must be a problem of self-information, because if you say that the bank has no information that the agent of the bank has, it means that the agent of the bank cannot extract ex ante this information of probability of default.
Yeah, this is an information that has, the bank has no, so that another way, it's not your question, but I think you're right that even in this informational context where there is no way for the loan officer to credibly convey information to the bank, you might be able to do better with nonlinear incentives. My guess is that you are right. And then there is another question, which is there would be a lot of value in improving the informational flow within the banks. One interesting thing is that another sort of a prediction of this model that I'm not going to spend too much time on, but is interesting is that when the bank grow as an organization, information is going to be even harder to circulate, and that might make this problem worse. And there is a paper by sort of the who's who of corporate finance. I think it has Rajan, Kashyap, Sharfstein, looking at mergers of banks in the US that shows that after a wave of mergers, which was, they use a sort of difference in difference type model because some states authorize mergers and some didn't, etc. You get a much worse lending in a bank that have two firms, in the bank that have merged than in a bank that have not, which kind of could echo this type of things. And it's not just a developing country problem, it's really a problem of banks as organizations. So I'll give you one evidence that comes from a sort of emerging market type of situation, which is an example from Argentina. So that's a paper by Herzberg, Liberty, and Paravicini. Some permutations of these authors have a series of very interesting papers on corporate finance issues, in particular banking issues. And that's one of them, which is trying to look for evidence of career concerns at banks and how that distorts the decisions of the loan officer. So consider just in your head, we are not going to put the math there, but an extension of the previous model where there is now 3 periods. There is this first period and then a third period, and then you're going to be rotated out. And the loan officers are, so the next problem is the loan officers are concerned that when there is a rotation, the new guy has no incentive to evergreen because he's not going to be held responsible for the default of his predecessor. So the first thing the new guy is going to do is to cut off all of the people that he deems not good. And let's say he can gather some information once he gets into the job. So the first thing he's going to do is to downgrade all the bad guys, and then that's going to look bad for the first loan officer. So if you are a loan officer and you're transferred and your successor is immediately downgrading half of your portfolio, that's going to give incentives to the bank, information to the bank that you were evergreening before. So anticipating that, you're going to bail out in period 2, but start downgrading in period 3. So that even if the people reimburse, the successful bad firms are going to reimburse and immediately be downgraded.
But in the next period, I will be fine with the bank because they will see that I'm trying to correct the things.
Yeah, so you could have, so now, so you, in period 1, you gave money. In period 2, you rolled over. You evergreened. At the end of period 2, you get reimbursed sometimes. Those people are going to be downgraded at the end of period 2, so that in period, and you're not going to lend to them anymore. You don't have to pay the default because they have been able to reimburse you, but you don't give them new money. So when the new guys come, they are not going to have to downgrade the loan. So all of the people of the previous model who were bad but have managed to reimburse because they were lucky the second period are going to be downgraded at the end of 2. So that's what they are looking for evidence of that. So they are looking at an Argentine bank where the loans are rotated to a new loan officer every 3 years. And they look at who is lending to them. They match data from other financial institutions as well. In total, they have about 1,248 firms and 1,000 loan officers. And this is the rotation pattern. So this is a chance that the relationship between a loan officer and a particular bank is broken. And you can see a spike at 36 months, which is exactly 3 years. It's not 1. So your probability to be rotated at 3 years is not 1, but there is really a big spike in rotation. So that's what they are exploiting. To say, are people taking anticipatory action at the end of quarter 2, at the end of year 2, sorry, before they get rotated out? So let me start by that graph, which tells you the internal risk rating, so how risky the loan is considered to be. And so higher is more risky. And you can see that, so this is the quarter of rotation and the quarter just before. So in the quarter of just before and the one immediately before that, they start to mark the firm more risky. And there is still a little bit of downgrading that is happening, but less than if they were, so they start to mark the firm more risky. I don't know why we have a 0 there actually. And then we can look at informativeness of the rating. So informativeness of the rating is obtained by a regression of the rating on future default that is observed, both from this bank and from the rest of the banking system. And there you can see that at 2 quarters before, 1 quarter before, and the quarter of rotation, suddenly the ratings become much more informative than at the end of period 2. So this is kind of the key, the high point of evergreening. And then just before being rotated, you are going to downgrade the rating, and you mark them more risky, and therefore the rating become more informative. So that's all a little bit indirect, and I'm going to show you in a little while. I want to do some stuff before that. Some other indirect measure of evergreening. Of course, it's a bit difficult to have a direct measure of evergreening. By definition, you don't see it. You just see that the loan was made, and slightly more direct evidence we had by looking with Sean Cole and Abhijit Banerjee. We had a paper on what banks do. So there was a wave in the mid-90s, mid to late 90s. There was a wave of default in Indian banks. There are waves of default in Indian banks frequently anyways. And the response was to institute and step up the activity of a commission called the Central Vigilance Commission. And basically these are sort of a SWAT team of people who were running into the bank and start to scrutinize every loans and actually charge people with criminal behavior, because the bank are national bank, and therefore fraudulent default is defaulting, stealing the people's money. So there was a big wave of fear of default. So you can think of it as an increase in the cost of default. And what we saw is that during this period, so the vigilance team used to come to the bank and scare everybody off. And then they would go into some other banks. So we had default, and we had the data on the universe of lending by public bank. And we look at what happens in the quarters immediately after a vigilance investigation. And you can see that officers just stop lending to anybody immediately after a vigilance investigation, because they are completely terrified that should they give a loan, the loan would go bad. So that gives you another type of evidence for that. So this is the sort of justifying the career concern idea, which is what happens to, in the Argentine case, what happens to you if you are found if your successor downgrades your portfolio. And you can see that if your successor downgrades your portfolio, later on you get less firms to manage and you get a lower portfolio to manage. So this is a sort of evidence that the loan officers have a good reasons to be concerned about downgrading. So this, there's nothing in there that is really about government banks. It's all about, this is just the fact that the banks are big and it's difficult in a large organization to provide incentives to the staff. The example that I gave from the bank mergers in the US suggests that it's a US problem. This bank is not necessarily a government bank. But in addition, one feature of many banks in developing countries is that they are public banks. They are public banks because, as I was saying in introduction, the government at some point felt that only public banks could be prevailed upon to lend in rural areas, lend to small entrepreneurs, etc. So the questions we can ask now is whether the incentives are even worse in public banks and whether the performance of public banks is even worse than the performance of private banks. I'm not going to provide you with, I'm not going to put down a model of that. I'm just going to show you some evidence of that, of the behavior of public banks. So first example is an example by Sean Cole, which is from India, where he looks at an election cycle in lending. So what he has is central bank data on the universe of loans given by banks, public and private, for 8 years. And he wants to look at whether public banks are lending more in election years than in non-election years, and whether this pattern of excessive lending seems to be strategic. Second question. And third question, whether it leads to misallocation with, or whether, even though it is strategic, it might just mean that since a lot of people are credit constrained, some people are winners and some people are losers, and that's fine as long as they are all equally productive. So in India, election takes place in principle every 5 years, but sometimes they don't happen quite on schedule because the government could decide to call an early election. It's like in the British system where they could just decide to call an early election. So what he does is that he looks at the next scheduled election, or in fact, you can also construct this cycle from the beginning of time, like what should have been the election if they had followed the regular pattern of being every 5 years. But for most of the paper, he looked at the next scheduled election, as in if there is an election scheduled or not in a particular year, 5 years later, you have a next scheduled election. And he looks at what happens in this year. And what you find is that we can look at bank credit and private bank credit to compare the two, and look at the effect of the next scheduled election on credit. And you can see that in a year where an election is scheduled, the public banks are lending 3% more. That's almost entirely driven by agricultural credit, so they are lending more to farmers, 6% more, but that's not true for the private banks. So this is the reduced form, which is just to look at what happens 5 years after an election, a scheduled year. Then you can do sort of, that's a bit cosmetic, but you can say let's use the scheduled election for the actual election, for whether the election took place. It's a very strong instrument, so you find almost the same results. So these banks lend more on election year, the public banks. That's not going to be a surprise to anybody who is familiar with anecdotes about banking in India, that the loans are also used as kind of handout to farmers to kind of promote the the government. Yep.
Is there cross-state analysis? Because if I know my party it's not going to be a swing state for me.
Yes, so I'll look at
Gujarat,
that.
for instance, for BJP is safe. So it won't
Excellent question. So that's the second question, which is, can you, the anecdote is that you do that for strategic reasons. To buy the votes, you can't really, it's not necessarily explicitly reciprocal, but you kind of buying, twisting the bank's arms to buy goodwill with the voters. So if that's the case, then you're exactly right. What we should see is that the lending would be particularly in swing states, if that's in order to sway votes. Alternative theory in political economy is that you're going to lend more in election years to your stalwart supporter just to keep them around. But you know, the most reasonable prediction is yours, which is you're not going to waste your money in safe places, and you're not going to waste your money in places that you're going to lose anyway. You should really direct the loan to the maximum extent possible in swing states. Let's look at that. I'll look at that first. And then we'll go back to these two things just to answer your question, which is which district do they tend to target? So to answer these questions, he computes the margin of victory of the winner of the election in the previous election. So that gives you a sense of whether that district is likely to be in the next election to be marginal or not. And then you can do it you can either take the absolute value of the margin of victory, with the idea that you're going to try and give the maximum possible amount in places where it's near zero. And then you can also separate it to say by ordering it by the party in power. So is it a marginal district that the party in power previously lost or previously won? And that's going to allow you to test this second possible theory, that you're going to try to give more of the loans to possibly to places that have your supporters. But so what we are finding when you use absolute margin of victory is that you are lending more to places which have a smaller absolute margin of victory. So the coefficient of the absolute margin of victory is strong and negative. So you're lending to these marginal districts. And in fact, it's reasonably symmetrical around defeat and success. So you are quite even-handed with your former supporters and your former opponent. You're just going to lend in places where you think it's going to make, you have more lending in places where it's likely to make a difference because the district was more marginal. So that seems to kind of support the view that lending to the bank is strategic, and it's kind of a way of curry favors, if not directly vote buying. This is just looking at the cycle. So the omitted variable here is 0. So it tells you that in every election in every year that is not an election, think of this as a regression that is run and the coefficients are in line instead of being in column, and 0 is omitted. So in every year that's not an election year, you lend less than in election years. So that's the election cycle, and that's relatively constant over years. So this is really the election year. That's kind of a big year where something happens. Now, we want to ask whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. And there are two ways in which we can look at that. Is first of all, are these political loans more likely to end up in default? And second of all, are these political loans leading to more output in the form or the others? So let's first look at the default. So to look at the default, you don't want to look at default in this year. You want to look at the default for the loan that originated in this year. So the way that the data is constructed is to relate the NPA means non-performing assets. To look at to relate back the non-performing assets that happen in the future to the year where the loan was originated. So you look at the entire history of the loan and whether it became NPA at any point. knowing that if it became NPA later in the time, this was a worse loan. And so when you do that, you find exactly the same type of things, which is the coefficient for public banks, the coefficient in non-election years are all negative compared to the year 0 of the election. So that means that you're recovering less of the loan in the election year. You're lending more, and you're more likely to be NPA. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, just your observation on non-performing loans, because I mean, an average investment is often considered to be 4 years, something like that.
Yeah.
So of course, if you 4 years before and 4 years later, this is the year of the election, so you will renew the loan, it's normal that you find a negative coefficient. So does it correct for that?
So here it's like, so the NPA definition that is being used typically in Indian data anyway is 2 quarters behind in the payment. I don't think if it was your question, but just clarifying that. So it's 2 quarters behind. So what you're saying is that the loans that are given in the years of the election, you're saying they will typically fail after 4 years, so you are again in election years.
No, you're before election year. Well, if you lend 4 years before an election year, when the loan will be renewed, it will be during an election year.
Oh, so but it's not related to the renewal. So typically, a lot of these loans, in particular, are because India has a separation between working capital loans and investment funds. So this is all working capital loans. So what happens with the working capital loans is that they are renewed every year. They are renewed every year and extended, increased sometimes and not. The limits. So what could happen, what happens occasionally, is a change in the limit. And that doesn't happen every year, but the renewal of the loan is happening every year. And the definition of an NPA is unrelated to a decision that is made on the loan. A loan becomes NPA when it's two quarters behind on the payment. So I don't think there is a cycle in. I thought what you were saying is that there is a natural cycle of the loans that they tend to default after 4 years, which I didn't know about. But there is nothing here that in the institutional environment that creates that cycle.